Hello class, my name's Andrew Cary and I will be covering overpopulation for my senior seminar presentation. Uh, Throughout the semester I chose to read Jeffrey K. McKee's book, Sparing Nature, The Conflict Between Human Population Growth and Earth's Biodiversity. Very good read. Moving on, some of the things that we will cover in this presentation. We'll take a look at Jeffrey K. McKee, which, as I've found throughout the semester, very limited information on the guy himself, but he has written quite a few books. We'll take a look at the three thesis statements that McKee lays out in the book. We'll look at some of the environmental concerns from 2000 to 2009, which the book was written in 2003. So some of the environmental issues Jeffrey K. McKee would have been dealing with back in the early 2000s. We'll take a look at the consequences of overpopulation and then some possible solutions. And then we'll kind of start and stop throughout, and I can talk about some of the sources that we used for science in the books and kind of how it correlates and ties back into some of the fundamental elements of McKee's argument throughout the entirety of the book. Anyway, hope you enjoy. Just a little introduction. We talk about there being a distinct relationship between human population growth and the loss of plant and animal biodiversity worldwide. This is not just an issue in the United States. Jeffrey K. McKee was the author of the book Sparing Nature. He's also an anthropologist, and he outlines the threats of overpopulation. And he also enlists some of the greatest minds in conservation and environmental science to help him unlock the key to success and longevity of environmentally sustainable human race and our planet as we know it. Hey class, so kind of on to Jeffrey K. McKee. He was the author of Sparing Nature, The Conflict Between Human Population Growth and Earth's Biodiversity, written in 2003. You can pick up a copy on Amazon, or there's a free copy on the APIS library. I prefer to have paper in front of me when I'm reading a book, and it's good to have in the library for later. Jeffrey K. McKee, there's not a lot of background or personal information about the author available online, which is kind of sad because from the few things that I learned about the guy, it seems like he has quite a bit to offer the environmental science community. And some background would be nice. I was able to locate his resume on the Ohio State University website, but that is really just a list of his accolades and publications. So there's not too much about Jeffrey K. McKee's personal life. He's written a few books to include Sparing Nature, obviously covered here in this course. He's also a professor at the Department of Anthropology and Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology at the Ohio State University. And he's considered to have neo-Malthusian a viewpoint towards population, right, and overpopulation. And this basically just means, we should be controlling the population through contraception or, good family planning, really just making those conscious efforts to control population, right? And, kind of what he explains throughout the book is like, hey, look, we could do plenty of simple conservation measures, or make choices to be sustainable, but at the end of the day, you're still going to be left with overpopulation being the overarching problem. And I think he continues to drive that home. Yes, should we be making sustainable choices? Environmentally friendly, clean energy. Yes, of course, but as far as being technologically advanced for that to be, for technology to kind of outweigh the fact that we have a population problem, we're not quite there yet, and that is something I've driven home in this course the entire time. So anyway, a little bit about Jeffrey K. McKee. Wish there was more about him, but we know he works as a professor at the Ohio State University, and he's become quite the prolific author when it comes to population and kind of humans, basically humans' connection to biodiversity loss, right, throughout history, up to and include 10,000 years ago, right? So and we're going to take a look at some of that as we go through the presentation here. Sparing Nature, a little bit about the book. In my opinion, it's largely unpopular, right? Of the neo-Malthusian position. People see having children and being able to have children, as many as they want, right, as a basic human right. For me, I think it took courage for Jeffrey K. McKee to defend his position. He's not only impacted the scientific community, but he's been able to inform the public of the risk of uncontrolled population growth with this book, and he covers it in some of his other publications too. Sparing Nature highlights the current historical negative impact of human population growth on Earth's biodiversity, right? So when Jeffrey K. McKee was digging in Africa, right, he's beginning to see the distinction between, as population growth sort of shot up, right, he's starting to see more and more species become extinct, and he's making those connections, right? So it's not just a last 50 years problem. It's, this has been something we've dealt with for millions of years, according to McKee. And he charges his, his readers to be more, make conscientious decisions about reproductive habits, like we were talking about. So the best thing that we can do, the way we can mitigate a mass extinction event for human beings, is to make more responsible choices when it comes to family planning. So, and one other great thing about this book, and he kind of explains it, is, there's all this technical research, and scientific documentation, technical documentation, kind of available to the reader, and it's hard to access all of it, right? So he kind of did the legwork with Sparing Nature, and geez, in the back side of the book, you can read, you can go through all the chapters and sections of the book and all of his references that he used, right? So if you were trying to reconstruct some of this research, it is possible. It's in the back of the book there. Sparing Nature thesis, right? There's 3 of them that he covers in the first chapter. And I'll quote him here. The first one being very close relationship between biodiversity loss and human population growth, right? We know that. The most important conservation measure we can take is to slow or halt the growth of the human population. And this is that neo-Malthusian, right? We need to slow or halt, okay, human population growth, right? Like, so above all else, what he's talking about, even, some of the greatest issues, right? Climate change, just sustainable practices in fishing, etc., right? Overpopulation, if it is not taken care of, it is going to continue to be the, I guess, waterfall effect for the rest of the conservation issues that we look at. And then lastly, conserving biodiversity is vital to the health of our planet and consequently is vital to us. Okay, so in the first chapter, he kind of charges his reader with, okay, let's do an exercise, mental exercise, right? And he's like, okay, we'll reconstruct the Earth basically. What is the least amount of biodiversity we need to sustain human life? And as you kind of go throughout, right, the soil, fauna, all the way up to, more complex species, right, and then onto the human race, right, you've essentially, after reconstructing what animals or species must be available and must be present, right, on the planet to sustain human life, you've ended up recreating basically the biodiversity that exists now, right? And we still don't quite know the extent of the rate of extinction of species. It has accelerated exponentially, but we don't quite know the extent of what the biodiversity loss is going to cause for, I guess, human existence. So anyway, those are the theses that Jeffrey K. McKee kind of lays out in the book here. All right, human population growth and biodiversity, and these next few slides I'm kind of tying to the theses of, what he kind of lays out in the first chapter there, right? So human population growth and biodiversity, we know we have a major biodiversity crisis. This human population growth, right, threatens the flora and fauna as well as human existence. So not just the species we rely on, and not just those services that we rely on. We have to understand, right, as the population grows, we're affecting these species, we're affecting their habitats, and we need to understand that every species plays a part in maintaining the Earth's ecosystem. If human population is not drastically reduced, extinction rates are going to rapidly increase. And then fossil records indicate, just like I was saying, some of those digs that McKee was a part of out in Africa, that there's a link between population growth, right, and the loss of biodiversity. It's not just now, right? It's not just the last 50 years. Okay, halting the growth of the human population, right? Well, that sounds kind of foreboding, and it is, right? People get scared, people get uncomfortable. They don't want to talk about halting population growth, right? Because that means we're doing something to fertility rates, or we're doing something or telling someone they can't have as many kids as they want, right? And so, there's kind of the China approach where you're forcing people to only have one child, and then there's other countries where they've said, okay, here we're gonna incentivize only having this many children, or we're gonna offer other benefits for women to have children later on, or other things that may fulfill women outside of having children. Focusing on women's rights and diversity in the workplace and things like that. It's a phenomenon that's causing increased stress to the planet and its resources. We're going to say a lot of the same things over and over again, right? In this PowerPoint. Environmental degradation and widespread poverty. We know those are huge issues that are going to result from basically uninhibited population growth. But we have to look at human rights compatible population control policies, right? We can't just tell people all of a sudden, oh, you have to get a vasectomy, or, oh, you've had one child, the female has to get surgery to prevent, or we can't do that, right? Because at that point, we've just become a giant human rights violator, right, as a country. Or, let's say I don't live in the United States, wherever I live, right, that's, look at the optic on China for their population control mechanism to only have one child, right? And then, look at ways to generate contentment that will delay the desire for having children. We need to be improving living conditions in developing countries. And then looking at propagation of widespread family planning services and implementing these into educational curriculums, right? I can't remember, other than, hey, make sure you're practicing safe sex. I don't ever remember a teacher in a sex ed class or any of my other classes saying, hey, look, you should consider the impact of having more than 2 children on the planet. It wasn't a thing. And I think that's a lot of where McKee comes from, is he's explaining to us, like, you guys are ignoring the biggest problem. We need to get these issues out into the, education community and let women know what their rights are, right? We can reduce these populations by achieving broad and diverse career opportunities for women. I'd say in the United States, we're doing a lot better job of it, but, the same thing can't be said for all over the world, right? In a lot of the places that I've gone and seen. And then we need to challenge those cultural customs that suppress sexual education and access to contraceptives, right? That goes on in a lot of places. And you can take a look at some of the resources that I've used to kind of put this together and formulate my own opinion right at the end of this slideshow, should you want to. And then biodiversity and the health of our planet, right? Every day there is a net gain of more than 200,000 people on the planet, or 146 people a minute. Is that sustainable? Probably not, right? And that kind of ties into the longevity of the older folks in our communities. You know, we are now having more children, but not only that, we are prolonging life for the older generation. So not a bad thing, right? Because we can look at, okay, if we are having less children and our there's more older people in the population, right? You know, that can also kind of correct or slow the population growth. And then, you know, one of the other horrible facts is that we're losing biodiversity 10,000 times faster than it was disappearing 100 years ago. Again, there's evidence of this, right? You know, planetary abuse must be controlled. There's journal articles specifically talking about overpopulation being planetary abuse, which I think is a very interesting way to look at it, right? You know, we never really think about, well, I've had 3 children, I've had 4 children, I can't really provide for them, you know, things like that as being planetary abuse, right? Because what are those offspring going to do, and how are they going to contribute or hurt, you know, just from their mere existence, hurt future generations, right, and access to resources. And then, you know, it's just, let's be honest, guys, it's not intelligent and it's not sustainable. Overpopulation, you know, we're going to be looking at resource wars, etc. And then technological fixes for global problems is wishful thinking. Okay, so throughout this class, people have continued to say there's some bright mind out there, access to the internet. Okay, so let's remember this book was written in 2003. All right, there was access to the internet then. Right, I remember dial-up and you know, yeah, okay, it was slow and there weren't as many resources available online, but they were there, right? So to say that access to the internet, and I know that's probably, there's a lot more that goes along with that argument, right? Probably access to information, etc. But it is wishful thinking, right, folks? Because we're not there yet, right? And I don't see us in technology keeping up with how quickly the population is growing, right? And then just to kind of tack onto that, I got a little graphic here that you can take a look at. Just shows human population and extinctions, right? So as to the human population, this is one of the most simple graphics that you could use, you know, as an example for what's going on with biodiversity loss. You know, as the human population has skyrocketed, so have extinctions. Boom, right? Very simple. And then let's look at some of the environmental concerns that, you know, may have fueled, right, Jeffrey K. McKee's thought process and what was going on. You know, he talks about going to his office. You know, he talks about how people show up there, right? And you know, he goes there for peace and quiet, to write papers, to grade paper, you know, et cetera, right, to do his work. But even this one spot that's in a remote rural area, right, people show up. And you know, that's just a testament to, right, there's lots of people, and there's only going to be so many places that you can go in the future, bottom line. So environmental concerns, 2000, 2009, there's a lot of resources out there, you know, that kind of explain what those might have been and what he might have been dealing with, right? But it's important to remember that, like, environmental concerns in the early 2000s, you know, outside of the big things that happened in the late 60s and early 70s with environmental policy, right, and the public paying attention. You know, you had Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, right? You know, 10 years later, they're banning, DDT. Okay, but I don't think we're really going to be to that point with the overpopulation argument, right? Because even though Jeffrey K. McKee is having an unpopular and uncomfortable conversation with the public through his work, it's different in a sense that I don't see, okay, Rachel Carson, you know, 10 years after the book was written, DDT's banned, right? I don't see the same thing happening with Jeffrey K. McKee's argument, right? Of, okay, overpopulation, right? You know, there needs to be some sort of moral coercion, right, to to fix this, right? And we need policy, and we need there to be some sort of population control, right? As unpopular as that may be. And I don't see that. Okay, so 2003, let's say 10 years later, right? That would have been 2013. Okay, we're almost looking at another 10 years after that. And population has only increased, right? And we look at, in 1999, the population doubled, right, from when McKee was basically born. And so I think that has a lot to do with it, right? Like, incredible timing. But anyway, so environmental concerns were going mainstream at the time. People are talking about it now, and they were talking about it in the early 2000s, right? Climate change and human-induced global warming is a big problem. We can see that just from, the temperatures that are happening at the, in the polar and Arctic areas. Believe it or not, third on the list, right, was overpopulation. Okay, so overpopulation was a huge deal, right? They hit that milestone of doubling the population. And then, again, access to fresh water, food scarcity, things like that. We've been dealing with that for generations, right? And especially, in areas in the Horn of Africa, right? Yemen, all over. I mean, access to fresh water has always been a problem and will continue to be. Oil and coal versus clean energy, that's a battle. I'm not sure I will probably even see in my lifetime as being one. But there are alternatives, right? And I covered that in one of my discussion posts throughout this class. And then we look at other issues. Endangered species, believe it or not, was a big issue. Nuclear energy, China and the amount that they pollute, right, was a big deal, right, in the first decade of the 2000s. And then we look at, oddly enough, back then they were looking at pandemics and superbugs, right? So as that population increased, the propensity for there to be, a pandemic, right, or these superbugs, right, and one of the biggest issues is all these doctors, right, overprescribing antibiotics, right? That's way off topic, but all that to say, it is an issue, right? And now we're looking at global pandemics, right? And look at how much easier with more people traveling and more people on the planet, how much easier it is to spread those diseases, right? Anyway, then, let's take a look at the consequences, of overpopulation. We're going to reach the 8 billion mark, and beyond that by 2025, right? That's 3 more years. And then, it only increases from there. I mean, some of the biggest issues that we're going to face: food scarcity, farming impact, deforestation, eutrophication, access to fresh water, like I mentioned before. We're already looking at climate change. We know from, Jeffrey K. McKee's work, biodiversity loss, huge, right? Something we rely on. Habitat destruction all over the world. Over exploitation of resources, right, and sustainable practices when it comes to fishing and harvesting, and then pollution, right? The amount of pollution and plastic that's being dumped and emitted, right, into our oceans is catastrophic. And then we look at invasive species, right, because as a byproduct of us traveling more people, more connections globally, right, we're both intentionally and unintentionally carrying invasive species from places where it doesn't belong, right? And that feeds into habitat destruction and biodiversity loss, right? And I never really looked at invasive species and kind of opening up travel around the world, right, as that being an issue, but it certainly is, right? There's evidence that points towards it. So some of the solutions that Jeffrey K. McKee talks about, and kind of some mainstream solutions to overpopulation would be, hey, let's look at family planning, right? And access to family planning resources. Education for women and men, right, on responsible reproductive habits. Gender equity, right? As more women around the world, not just the United States, have access to jobs that are comparable to what men possibly have been employed doing in those parts of the world, right? It's going to allow women to find, maybe that's fulfilling to them, right? And maybe they don't need to have 10 kids because they've got a job that is fulfilling, keeps them busy, etc. looking at ways to decrease fertility rates, that kind of all ties together, right, is, access to contraceptives, etc. Again, we need to be promoting those responsible reproductive habits, right? And it needs to start in the classroom. It needs to start when kids are young, right? And it just seems like from when I was, in middle school, high school, right, the access to resources has certainly increased. But, with social media, it's also over-sexualized, kids, I think, at too young of an age. And, those are concerns, right? So not forcing, but, encouraging contraceptives and explaining the access that children have to that, right? Both men and women. And then looking at a household maximum of 2 children. I don't see anything wrong with that, right? I have 2 kids myself. I can't imagine having a third. I know a lot of people get a lot of enjoyment out of a third, right? But it's about doing it responsibly and, with the resources that we have available to us, right? And then I really liked this. McKee talked about this at the end of his book, subtle coercion, right? Why aren't we doing tax breaks for people that are having fewer children, right? Because really, you kind of have to come to this conclusion on your own. You need to do your own research about the issue with, overpopulation. And women and men are only going to be able to arrive at that conclusion if they've seen the evidence, right, or if it's touched them or impact them, right? So then you have to start looking at incentives, giving people money to have fewer children. So that's just one. Those are just some of the solutions that we've looked at between McKee and some of the other folks' research that I used for this. These are some of the options that are available, right? But at the end of the day, it boils down to people being responsible and making conscious efforts to be responsible and understanding the long-term impacts for future generations of overpopulation. So solutions to overpopulation. I really appreciate you hanging out with me, taking the time to listen to what I have to say about overpopulation. Digging, and I know I've gone way long on my presentation time, but it's important to me. You can't get into all the nitty-gritty of all the research that's possible and all the intricacies of the book, Sparing Nature. The only thing I can say is that I would just encourage each and every one of you, or each and every person that's going to listen to this presentation, to pick up the book. It will make you think, especially if you have kids or think about having kids. It really does put it into perspective. So summary here. To put it simply, overpopulation is avoidable through simple conservation measures and responsible family planning. Let's be honest, folks. The fate of the human species and so many others depend on it. So I just encourage everybody to kind of take a second look at overpopulation and really what a major conservation issue it is. And I've kind of just been trying to rack that home throughout this entire semester. Next slide, references. Please take a look at that. And then finally, you can find my email address here should you have any follow-on questions. Thank you so much for your time, guys. I look forward to comments, etc. And congratulations, everybody. It's been an absolutely fantastic semester. Thank you.